Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tata. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tata.
Hey there, friend. Welcome back to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. This week, we're discussing the concept of the embodied mind with internationally renowned author and psychiatrist, Dr. Thomas R. Verny. Our current understanding of the way the human body works is that it is a series of interdependent physiological relationships. So that includes things like muscle interacting with bone. Your heart responds to different hormones that are secreted by the brain. And this really goes all the way down to how one cell can communicate with another cell. Basically, to make our human organism, our human body function, no one component works alone, or no one component works in isolation. In light of this, why is it that the accepted understanding of the physical phenomena of the mind is attributed only to the brain? The work of Dr. Verny is redefining our concept of both the mind and the human consciousness. He has brilliantly compiled a new list of research that points to the fact that the mind is actually tied to every single part of the body. The mind is not just located inside your brain. Dr. Verny's concept of the embodied mind collects research findings from the areas of physiology, genetics, psychology, and quantum physics in order to illustrate the mounting evidence that our body cells, or our somatic cells, not just the brain and nerve cells, are actually able to store memory. This, of course, has implications on how we view the mind, how we view consciousness, and even how we view human behavior. I find this to be a really fascinating topic, and one that's especially important in pain care because we have put so much emphasis on the brain, and with that, we conflate oftentimes that the mind and the brain are working together, when in fact, a lot of research actually supports the fact that the mind is a function of every system in your body, and in fact, your entire body is a representation of your mind. Of course, this has implications for health and wellness and disease, and how we view pain and trauma recovery. Okay, without further ado, let's begin, and let's meet Dr. Verny and learn about the embodied mind.
Hi there, Dr. Verny. Thanks for joining me this week.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to chat with you, and I know everyone else is very interested in learning about your work. As I mentioned in our kind of pre-introduction here, I did read your book cover to cover. I recommend people read it. It's really a fascinating read, steeped in science, which is wonderful. So the book is called The Embodied Mind, Understanding the Mysteries of Cellular Memory, Consciousness, and Our Bodies. And there's really just so much in there that speaks to both the mental and physical health challenges that people are struggling with nowadays.
Yes.
Your training obviously is in psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
Why was it important for you to write a book on embodiment?
Well, it really goes back a long time, if I may. When I was 13 years old, I was in Vienna. The first book, actually, that I read in German, because I'm originally from Czechoslovakia. I was born in Bratislava. So I did not speak German. And the first book that I actually read in German after I learned how to speak German was Freud's interpretation of dreams. And that really turned me on to psychoanalysis. And it is then that I sort of made up my mind that I would become a psychiatrist. And then I did become a psychiatrist, but I continued to be interested in dreams. And dreams often took me back to my patients' childhoods. So I became very interested in memory, mm-hmm. and early memories. And so early memories then took me to birth and even the prenatal stage. And as you probably know, I wrote the book, The Secret Life of the Unborn Child. And that was in 1982, a long time ago. And that became an international bestseller, and it's still going strong. It has been translated into 27 languages now. But one of the things that has always bothered me, and I'm coming to answer your question, one of the things that has always bothered me was that there was very good scientific evidence to show that children sort of from let's say, the end of the second trimester, in other words, 6 months after conception, had developed their brains sufficiently to lay down memories, but there was absolutely nothing to support any sort of case histories or what people would say under hypnosis that would support scientifically the possibility of laying down memories before the age of 6 months. So I've always been interested. So since the writing of that book and being involved with birth and prenatal psychology, I was always interested in memory. And then about 8 years ago, I read this report in one of the scientific journals about a 44-year-old Frenchman who went to see his doctor because he had a weakness in his left leg. And so the doctor did many laboratory tests, x-rays, etc. And to their complete astonishment, to the astonishment of the doctor and the patient, they found that the patient had virtually no brain. Where his brain was supposed to be in his skull, there was only a thin crust of brain tissue, and the rest of his skull was cerebrospinal fluid, which is called in medical parlance hydrocephalus, just water essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this man was gainfully employed in the French civil service. He was the father of 2 children, and for all intents and purposes, he acted normal, he thought normally. So that made me kind of stop in my tracks. And I thought to myself, how is this possible? How can a man with no brain essentially be so normal? And so that's when I started looking into the fact that actually there were a lot of reports in the scientific literature about people who have had half of their brain removed for seizures or because of tumors, all kinds of other reasons. And so I became interested to see, well, what allows these people to have memory? What allows them to function normally? So if it's not the brain, well, where are these memories stored? Where is the mind, so to speak? Because if you look at the medical literature, if you look at neuroscience, I would say 95% of neuroscientists believe that the mind is the product of the brain. It's sort of like they call it, like a function of the brain, an epiphenomenon, they call it.
Mm-hmm.
So just like, for example, urine is a function of the kidneys. But when you stop and think about that, surely the mind cannot be equated with urine. I mean, it's like a totally different phenomenon, right? So that's when I started researching, and my book took me seven years to write, actually, because I wanted to make sure that what I was onto was scientifically validated. And so I came to the conclusion, and the book then identifies that and details it. I came to the conclusion that really all the cells in the bodies, including the brain, but everything else, they all work together. It's like a backup system on your computer. It's sort of the iCloud. And the whole body acts as a holistic system, or a backup system, if you like, to everything that we think and feel, and to our minds, so that the mind, rather than being a function of the brain alone, is a function of the whole body, which, when you think about it, I think makes a lot of sense. So that's how I came to the conclusion of calling it the embodied mind, because it's not the old brain mind, it's the embodied mind.
It's really interesting to think about the example of the person with little brain tissue, shall we say?
Yes, we can say that.
Yeah, I mean, because in our society, I think right now especially, we're kind of very, what I would consider neurocentric or brain centric, and we look at the brain as you mentioned, the seat of the mind.
Yes.
We also look at the brain as the seat of intelligence.
Yes.
And the idea of not having a brain, how could you possibly survive, so to speak? Although I think those of us who work in physical rehabilitation and other areas of healthcare realize that people do have brain injuries, they do have strokes, and you do see function return at times.
That's right. Well, part of that is sort of our culture, because, we have been in a patriarchal culture for God knows how many centuries.
Right.
And the patriarchal culture very much, is oriented towards the head. Who is the head honcho? Who heads this committee? Okay. The president is the head of government. It's always the head, the head, the head. So medicine, philosophy, and all the other sciences have bought into that system unknowingly, unconsciously. So everything is top down. And what I'm calling for in my book is, there's obviously we do need the brain, but we also have to look at the bottom up system. We also have to look at the rest of the body. And that is so important. It is so important because, like, if you look at brain diseases like Alzheimer's, you're too young to worry about it. But when you get to my age, and all my friends and family, they all worry, oh my God, I've forgotten the name of this or that. Is this the beginning of Alzheimer's, right? So what do neuroscientists do? They look at the brain and they try to find, what is sort of a counter to the amyloid plaques that seem to be part of Alzheimer's. But scientists in Australia have been able to find that actually the liver produces amyloid proteins. And so these amyloid proteins go to the brain and produce Alzheimer's. True, but should we not look also at these amyloid proteins that are produced in the liver? And if we would be able to stop their production or stop their delivery, at least to the brain, we could perhaps prevent Alzheimer's. But today, scientists, by and large, don't look at anything below the neck to see what is going on in the brain. So this is one of the problems that we are facing today. And if I may, just one more example, may I? The gut. I'm sure that and hopefully many of our listeners know that gut bacteria have become incredibly important in health and disease. And so, whatever happens in the gut influences the brain, and whatever happens in the brain influences the gut. So once again, we have to look at the system rather than cut off the brain from the rest of the body.
So we've mentioned like a bunch of terms so far. So we have, people obviously know the brain as an organ.
Yes.
We've mentioned the word mind, but you've taken some care to kind of build out your own construct as the mind is more than just the function of the brain, that this idea of an embodied mind is really kind of if I'm reading it right, the processes of your entire body and physiology, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yes.
How do you define embodiment? Because that's really kind of, it's part of your book and your thesis here.
Yes. Well, embodied to me means that it is a function of the whole body, rather than looking at individual cells or individual tissues or individual organs like the brain. It is all of that together. And, for a long time, we have had sort of this phrase of mind-body therapy. Like Harvard University has got a health letter that they send out every week, I think. And the other day they sent out a health letter about the fact that your mind influences your gut. And that's true. So if you have anxiety, you're more likely to produce ulcers. But they never talk about the fact that your gut and the microbes and the viruses, about 5 pounds, we carry about 5 pounds of bacteria in our gut. I mean, it's huge. And these also affect the brain, because these little bacteria produce millions of substances which have an effect on the brain. For example, serotonin is mostly produced in the gut. And you know that serotonin has been sort of involved in lack of serotonin has been involved in depression, that it is thought by some people that a lack of serotonin at least adds to the possibility or to the development of depression. So we have all these antidepressive drugs that are supposed to increase serotonin in the brain. But the fact is that the serotonin is produced in the gut, mostly. And so once again, when we talk about the embodied mind, it's very difficult to define the mind, as consciousness is a little bit easier. The mind is difficult, but it's one of those words that I think most of us know what we mean by it, but it's really difficult to define. And all I can say is that rather than it being just a product or a function of the brain, it really involves the whole body, and probably much more than that. Probably it involves also everything around us, like the universe. And so when you really get deeply into quantum mechanics and you get deeply into studying the mind and consciousness, it's very difficult to escape some awareness of a spiritual dimension to the mind, that that our mind might be very much part of a greater mind out there. I really don't know. But I'm speaking on my podcast actually to a lot of people who know much more about the mind than I do, and consciousness and spirituality. And there's a strong feeling out there amongst really, really clever intellectual people who feel that our mind is connected to something other than just our bodies, in addition to being connected to our bodies. But this is still a mystery to me. All I can say is that I'm absolutely certain that it's not just the brain, but that it is the whole body, which is why I called the book The Embodied Mind.
And you also mentioned kind of the social context, which
Yes.
starts to point a little bit to the kind of growing theory of embodied cognition.
Yes.
Which recognizes that there are bottom-up as well as top-down processes that happen, but also your body, your human body, is embedded within a social construct.
Right. And the
and
social
that environment
construct. Yes.
is having an impact on you.
Well, yes. And then, it's like concentric circles, right? So, here's our body, and then there's the body politic out there, the community which influences us, the culture, the climate, the environment, and then the larger universe. And then beyond our constellation and our universe, there's an infinite number of universes out there. So it's a mysterious world, actually, that we live in. At one time, I think 100 years ago, scientists thought that they had answered all the questions. And now we are finding that there are more questions than answers.
Yeah. It is really interesting to think that our mind can extend beyond our body.
Yes. Yes.
Right? Because then, and if minds are extending beyond our body, and our minds in some way are interacting, then it means that the health of your mind in Canada,
yes,
or poor health of your mind, let's say in Canada, could impact my well-being here in New York City, let's say.
Absolutely. You wonder about the suffering, that is present in our world all the time. I mean, I just saw a movie the other day. It was called The Swimmers. Have you heard of it?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, it's about two sisters from Syria, Damascus, who escaped. And when you watch them, as refugees trying to go from Syria to Germany, I mean, what those poor people went through, right? the degradation, the suffering. And that's just two people. And that's being multiplied every day by millions of people out there, because there are millions of refugees right now. And then you look at the war in Ukraine, for example, where people are going hungry and cold and everything. And so you wonder what all this how, you said, well, what I'm thinking in Canada might influence how you think in New York. But what about all this suffering that goes on? How is that affecting us?
I like the idea of bringing this all together, because I'm still under the opinion that our medical system is so parsed into different pieces, and at times there are benefits to that.
Yes, no doubt.
But I just find more and more the way things are heading is that we need to kind of bring concepts together rather than separate them out. I mean, even the fact that a psychiatrist, a well-respected psychiatrist, is saying, hey, we need to pay attention to the body.
Yes.
Because the body is informing the mind.
Yes.
That, of course, makes people like me who work more in a body-centric practice happy.
Yes.
But I think there are principles that we should all embody as professionals.
Absolutely. And that's another one of the things that unfortunately has happened in this top-down system that we have bought into, is what you have rightfully pointed out in terms of specialization. So cardiologists are only interested in the heart, and urologists are only interested in the kidneys and the bladder. And none of them work together or talk to each other about things that are common, let's say, to both of those diseases, right? So for example, atherosclerosis, okay? When your arteries get plugged up by plaques made of cholesterol and all kinds of stuff. So people who are specialists in, I guess, blood diseases and atherosclerosis look at the plaques, and they tell you that if you start developing those plaques, whatever, and you are likely to get coronary artery disease, thrombosis, any of those things, how to cut down on your intake of this substance or that substance, etc. They don't realize because they don't read the literature on that, because it does not it's not coming to them from other doctors who study the same thing. But they don't realize that really atherosclerosis is an inflammation of the whole system of arteries. Right. And that when you have that kind of inflammation, that as a result of that inflammation, there are signals sent to the brain, which tells the brain that down here we have an inflammation and you should be doing something about that. So then the brain sends out more signals to the body, which are trying to suppress the inflammation, but actually they increase it because they're producing more stress hormones. So you have more adrenaline, norepinephrine, you have cortisone being produced, and all of those substances increase the plaques in the atherosclerosis. So it's crazy, because we could do a lot more for those people if, for example, neurologists would talk to the people whose name I right now forget, who specialize in treatment of blood diseases, right? Mm-hmm. So internists, perhaps. So again, it's this division. It's the division between the brain and the body, the division between the different specialties. And of course, then we have huge divisions in our society in terms of race and color and religion. So, what we need is just to bring everybody together, just as I'm trying to indicate with your help, that we need to bring the brain and the body together. We need to fight this separation, this division in our society, and it has kind of flooded us also in medicine.
Mm-hmm. It certainly has. You mentioned war and things like that, and I want to come back to that in a little while and talk about trauma.
Sure.
But before we do that, I want to talk about the idea of cellular intelligence in your book, and you've already started to talk a little bit about it. There's an abscess of a brain, and if supposedly the brain is where memory is kind of generated and stored, if that's not working, the body or the cellular components of the body potentially have the ability to do that. Can you tell us how that works and why kind of the idea of cellular intelligence is central to the book?
Well, one of the things that people don't realize is that regular cells, like whatever cells we have in our bodies, whether it's in our skin, whether it's in our heart, whether it's in our livers, are not that different from neurons. Neurons developed from very, very primitive cells in unicellular organisms millions of years ago. And so when we look at any cell in the body, we see all the requirements for laying down memories, just as neurons have. Neurons are not the only cells that can lay down memories. And although cells in our bodies are incredibly small, yet they contain there is huge space in this tiny cell. And there's of course DNA, which contains the blueprint for everything in our bodies, like the blueprint for our body developing. And so DNA contains millions of facts, and whether you want to call them facts or whether you want to call them memories doesn't really matter. The fact is that cells are able to contain a great deal of material, so to speak. And so, for example, in cardiac cells, probably there is some research to show that they really contain very important emotional information about the person, so that when you get heart transplants, which is one of the chapters in my book, you find some very interesting information. You find that a number of people, not everybody, but a number of people who have had heart transplants have also developed totally new personalities, which when it was checked out, seemed to correspond to the personality of the donor. Mm-hmm. So, for example, one woman who was only interested in other women and would only eat vegetarian food, when totally not to her knowledge, unknown to her, she received the heart of a young man, suddenly became heterosexual, started to eat hamburgers, a real change in personality, which later then was found to correspond with the personality of the donor. Furthermore, she also complained of having this chest pain, as if something was hitting her in the chest. And later it was found out that this young man died in a motorcycle accident when he was hit by a car. So, how is this possible unless there is cellular intelligence, cellular memory, which can be transferred? And again, in my book, I quote a scientist, I think from California, by the name of Glassman, who has done transfers of cells from one animal to another, and has shown that as a result of the transfer, the animal that received the donated cells was able to remember, and that was shown, by the way, that they ran mazes in a more successful way than other animals who were controlled. And then, of course, there are incredible experiments by Mike Levin from Massachusetts, Tufts University, Massachusetts, who, according, I've had the pleasure of interviewing him And I think he is one of the smartest people, really, honestly, that I have ever met. I mean, this man is incredible. And he has done experiments on planaria, and he has shown that he took planarians who were taught to run mazes, and then they were able to run them successfully. Then he chopped them up into tiny little parts, gave the parts to eat to the other planarians. The other planarians ate the parts. Or he chopped up the parts, and then from the little parts grew total new planarians. And these new planarians, whether they were from the tail or the middle of the body, were almost as good at running mazes as the original planaria. But it only worked when they developed a brain. So the brain was necessary, but it wasn't necessary for the memories to be there. So there's a lot of research that shows that, in fact, cells can contain memories. And so it is, if we can talk about artificial intelligence, I don't see why we can't talk about cellular intelligence.
Yeah. It's really interesting to think about the expression muscle memory from that.
Yes. Oh, well, you would know that. And body memory, of course.
Yeah. I mean, muscle memory from the sense that, obviously the heart is, as you mentioned, storing some kind of emotional information.
Yes.
But in sports and things like that, we always talk about muscle memory.
Absolutely.
And for a long time, I mean, the idea of, most of our movements are subconscious. We're not thinking about them.
Right.
So they're probably not, in some ways, always hitting higher, cortical areas. So is there some type of memory embedded in our muscle tissue, or
absolutely
in our fascia, which is another kind of highly debated topic in my profession?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I know that. It reminds me. My hairdresser told me a story about her mother, who was very severely Alzheimerish, and but one day, and not able to talk or anything, but one day she took in a little doll for the mother, and the mother just picked up the doll and totally naturally, as if it was a baby, and started moving with her and humming to her. Body memory right there. The brain wasn't working, but something was working.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about the transgenerational transmission of trauma, because that there's a lot of talk now just in social circles about it. Of course, the psychology world has been talking about it, but we're all kind of waking up to the idea that the traumas that we experience may not just rest inside us, that potentially they can be passed down in some way. Can you start to kind of unpack what that really means to us in the kind of the sense of embodiment and some of the kind of cellular memory that we've been talking about?
Yes.
Because it extends trauma to beyond just being a psychological experience then.
Exactly. Yes. There's so many different ways of answering that question. If we look at stress, which is, sort of universally acknowledged as being a factor in health, right? If we look at stress, we know that when a person is under stress, they're producing stress hormones. We know that the effect of these stress hormones on our bodies, right? Like if you're under stress, you're more likely, your immune system goes down, you're more likely to develop inflammations, diseases, you develop a cold more easily, stuff like that. Okay. But when you go back further in terms of epigenetics and transgenerational transmission of trauma, when you look at, for example, mothers who are stressed, not only during pregnancy, which would be straightforward, that's not really transgenerational, that would be just one generation. But when you look at future mothers, let's say before conception, and if they are stressed, that stress is going to affect her ovaries and the eggs, the ova in her ovaries, right? And the same thing happens with fathers. The same thing happens, of course, with environmental toxins. Um, Good research on fathers, for example, smoking before conception and how that affects the baby that will be the product of that conception. So um, in the past, it was thought that only genes are responsible for the blueprint, and which then is responsible for everything that develops in you, okay? From the very first zygote, the meeting of the ova with the sperm, which is called the zygote. So from the very first meeting of that, everything then is sort of written in stone according to oogenetics, because that is going to your blueprint and that's it. But today, certainly during the last 30 years, it has become very well established that the genes are not your destiny, and that really the genes are just like a blueprint for your house. But then, whether you select, I don't know, brown bricks or yellow bricks is going to make a difference. And it will still follow the blueprint, but it will be a totally different house. And then, if you decide that you only want to have one story instead of two stories, well, then it will change, right? So it's the same thing that happens in terms of our genetic endowment. It is not written in stone, and it can constantly change from moment to moment, which makes, again, a lot of sense when you think of, of how we develop, because it really wouldn't make sense in terms of human survival if we could not change in response to the environment, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to do that, and we do. We are capable of that. And so when we have stress, or when the father is smoking before conception, then some of that is being passed through his sperm to the new baby. But what is also then even more interesting, because like I said, that's pretty straightforward. So all these people now who are under stress, whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Syria or Africa or anywhere else, they will all be suffering of this. But then in addition to that, there are psychological factors such as fear and anxiety, which will also affect cells. And that this information will be carried forward into the child, and from the child into that child's child. So that's how you have 2, 3, 4 generations that are being affected by whatever happened in the first generation. And there are a lot of geneticists now working all over the world who are exploring this, and who are showing the effects of the transgenerational transmission of trauma. In Lethbridge, Canada, there's a wonderful geneticist. Her name is Meltz, G. Meltz. I forgot exactly the first name, Galinda. I think her name is Galinda Meltz. And she has done an incredible amount of research on transgenerational trauma. And certainly in mice, she has shown that it carries on for 4 generations. Mm. That a stressed mother mice will create stressed children, will create more stressed children, etc., etc., etc. So in addition to that, of course, just to round out the answer here, you have hunger, you have lack of food that many of these people are, many of the refugees, many of the people who are starving in Ukraine, etc., are exposed to. So there is lack of proper food, and then there's lack of proper air. The air is full of nitrous oxide and sulfites and, all these other things. So all of those things will have an effect on the sperm and on the ova of the people involved, which then will be passed on to future generations. There's simply no doubt about that. And so in this world, we are creating more and more people who are unhealthy in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you have to, that we need to realize is that if, for example, a mother is pregnant and she's under a lot of stress and she's producing stress hormones, too many stress hormones, that will actually affect the wiring of the brain of that child. And so honestly, it's so simple to visualize and to realize that that poor child is already going to be born with a miswired brain. Just like your computer, could be miswired. It will never be as good as it was, originally intended to be. So we are creating children all over the world who will not be at their best. And that's going to create more problems for this world.
Some people don't like to rely on mouse studies, but I think there are certain instances where they give us some really good information for us to think about as clinicians and human beings.
Absolutely.
If there's research that trauma can be transmitted over 3 to 5 generations, mm-hmm. do we have any information either from human studies or animal studies that show that when we embed humans and communities in a healing environment, how fast that it could change, that epigenetic kind of environment could change our then genes and our phenotype, so to speak?
Yes, and I'm glad you asked that so that we don't end on a negative note here. Yeah, that's the positive. That's the good side of epigenetics, okay? That it can really go both ways. It can be destructive and it can be constructive. It has been shown, for example, that loving, caring parents can repair a lot of the damage that was done to the child in utero, or perhaps even at birth, right? Because some births are traumatic. Cesarean births, for example, protracted births, having the cord around your neck, things of that nature can be very traumatic. So loving, kind attention can repair a lot of the damage. And so that's really, really important. Human contact, loving, caring, human contact is incredibly important and beneficial, and can counter a lot of the trauma, a lot of the damage. So like, they say, what, an apple a day keeps the doctor away? Mm-hmm. I would say a hug a day keeps the trauma away.
Right.
Yeah.
So we can't underestimate the impact of human co-regulation to help someone overcome what they're experiencing.
Exactly. You put it beautifully. Yes.
Yeah. I appreciate really the perspective of your book. I mean, it somewhat looks at our disconnected and disembodied health system and really says it's time to connect all these parts and to look at, our entire universe as one embodied experience, and especially, within human to human.
Everything is connected.
Everything is connected. Yeah. It's as I read through the book, I'm like, wow, this is really a much broader perspective than you'll get in any medical training. I mean, I have friends that are physicians, as you mentioned, they specialize in things. I went through a medical training myself, more specialized in that sense, but this is really a broader perspective. I once again want to point people to the book. It's called The Embodied Mind, Understanding the Mysteries of Cellular Memory, Consciousness, and Our Bodies. You can find that wherever books are sold, Amazon and other book dealers. Dr. Verny, it's been great speaking with you. Can you let everyone know how they can learn more about you and follow your work?
Thank you very much for asking. Yes, well, I have my website, trvernymd.com. That's my website. I also have blogs on Psychology Today. And then I have a weekly podcast called Pushing Boundaries with Dr. Thomas R. Verny. So all of those places are where you can find me.
And of course, all the links to what Dr. Verny just mentioned will be on the show notes at the integratedpainscienceinstitute.com. You can go over there and find those links, but make sure to check out his website at trvernymd.com and make sure to check out The Embodied Mind. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta. It's a pleasure being here with you this week, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed meeting you.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. That's integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.